In the year 2147, the world was not the same as before. Nations had broken into kingdoms, and power was taken by those who could lead armies. Among them was Queen Alara of the Eastern Dominion. She was known for her strength, but also for her calm face that hid a storm of thoughts. She ruled from her stone palace where banners of gold and red moved in the wind. Many feared her, and many respected her. But none could ignore her. Captain Luke Mercer was a man from the West. He had fought in many battles and carried the scars of war on his hands and face. He was not a man of soft words, but of action. He believed in freedom and had never bowed to any crown. He became known as a warrior who could not be broken, and this made him a symbol among his people. Still, his name was spoken in the court of the Queen, as if fate had tied them together. One night the war drums beat through the land. The Queen called for Luke Mercer to come to her palace. He walked through the great hall where torches burned against the tall stone walls. Soldiers lined the path and nobles watched in silence. His boots echoed on the floor as he moved closer to the throne. He did not kneel when he reached her. His eyes met hers, and for a moment, the room was silent. Queen Alara stood with her crown shining under the firelight. Her armor was dark and engraved with golden lines. Her voice was steady, but carried a weight that shook even the strongest hearts. She told him that the war had gone on long enough. Her words cut through the silence like a blade. "Marry me," she said, "or the war will continue." It was not a question. It was an order and a promise. Luke felt his chest tighten. He had faced arrows and swords without fear, but this was different. The Queen was not asking for his love. She was placing the lives of thousands in his hands. If he said no, the war would rage, and rivers of blood would follow. If he said yes, he would bind his life to the woman who had once been his enemy. The air grew heavy as the court waited for his answer. He looked at her and saw not only a ruler, but a woman who carried the weight of nations. Her eyes did not tremble. Her stance did not weaken. She was not just seeking a husband, she was demanding peace through him. Luke's mind fought against his heart. He remembered the faces of his men and the cries of families who had lost everything. He also remembered the ashes of his homeland taken by her armies years ago. For the first time in years, Luke Mercer felt unsure. He had always known where to strike and how to stand. But now he stood in front of something larger than a battlefield. His choice would shape the future of both East and West. The Queen waited in silence, her hand resting on the hilt of her sword, not in threat but in power. It was clear that the fate of the world now rested on his reply. He did not speak at once. Instead, he breathed slowly and let his eyes linger on her crown, the mark of a ruler who had fought for her throne. He thought of the cost of war and the burden of peace. He saw the fire in her eyes and knew she would not bend. In that moment, he understood that this was not only about duty or pride, it was about destiny. And destiny had brought him to the Queen's Hall where one answer could change everything forever. Luke Mercer left the Queen's Hall that night with a storm inside him. The torches of the palace burned behind him, but their light did not reach his thoughts. He walked through the courtyard, where guards stood silent, and the banners of the Dominion swayed in the cold wind. He could still hear her voice in his mind. "Marry me, or the war continues." Those words chased him like shadows. He returned to the camp of his men, who waited beyond the gates. They saw the weight in his face, but dared not question it. Luke sat by the fire while the flames flickered against the dark sky. He thought of his past and the oaths he had taken. He had sworn to fight for his people, not to serve a throne. Yet now, the Queen had forced a choice upon him that no sword could fight. His heart was heavy with the thought that peace might rest in his hands alone. In the days that followed, he tried to fight the thought of her offer. He trained with his men and rode with his captains. Still, the image of Queen Alara stood before his eyes. Her calm face, her steady voice, her crown that carried the weight of nations. She was his enemy, yet she spoke as if she knew his soul. His pride told him to refuse, but his spirit whispered of the lives that would be lost if he did. Whispers grew in the court and in the camps. Some said the Queen wanted him for strategy to bind the West and East with marriage. Others said she wanted to tame the one man she could not conquer. There were also those who believed fate itself had joined them in this strange path. Luke did not listen to rumors, yet he could not escape them. They circled him like birds waiting for his fall. One evening, Claire, a friend from his homeland, came to him. She had served as a scout and spy for years. Her voice was softer than the Queen's, but carried its own strength. She told him that peace was worth more than pride. She reminded him of the villages burned and the children who had lost fathers. She asked him if he would let war continue when a choice stood before him. Luke did not answer her at once, but her words planted seeds in his mind. Alone in his tent that night, he stared at the blade he had carried for years. It was marked by battles that had shaped his life. He wondered if all those fights had led to this single moment. He was a man of war. But could he become a man of peace, if it meant binding himself to a queen who had once been his foe? He thought of her eyes that did not waver and her voice that did not break. He thought of the silence that had filled the hall after she had spoken. It was as if the world itself had paused, waiting for his choice. As the moon climbed higher, he walked outside and looked at the stars. The night was quiet and the air sharp with cold. He whispered to himself, though no one heard. He did not fear death nor the weight of war. What he feared was the unknown path that marriage to a queen would open. It was not only his life that would change, but the life of every man, woman, and child in the kingdoms. Still deep within him, he felt something he could not explain. It was not love yet. It was not hate. It was a pull toward her, as if their lives had been tied together long before they had spoken. He did not know if it was fate or madness, but he knew it would not leave him. And so, as dawn began to break and the sky turned pale, he made a vow to face her again. He would not run from this choice. He would meet her words with his own and find the truth that waited in her eyes. The morning after Luke had made his vow, he was called again to the palace. The sun lit the towers in gold and the air was filled with the sound of horns. He walked through the gates with steady steps, though his heart carried storms. When he entered the throne room, Queen Alara was waiting. Her crown caught the light, and her armor gleamed with lines of gold. The court was quiet as he moved closer. No one spoke until she raised her hand. She told him that before he gave his answer, he must know the truth. She led him away from the throne and into a hidden chamber deep within the palace. The room was filled with scrolls and stone tablets marked with signs of old. The air was heavy with dust, but also with meaning. She pointed to one of the scrolls and asked him to read. Though the words were strange, he could understand their heart. It spoke of a warrior from the west and a queen from the east whose union would decide the fate of the kingdoms. Together, they would bring either ruin or peace that would last for generations. Luke stood still as the words sank into him, turned to her and asked if she truly believed this. Her face was calm, but her eyes held a fire he had not seen before. She said she had carried the prophecy since she was a child. It had been told to her by her father before he died in battle. Every step she had taken, every war she had fought, was shaped by this promise of fate. She told him that when she saw him in battle years ago, she knew he was the one the prophecy spoke of. Her voice did not break, but he could feel the weight she carried. She was not only a ruler, she was a woman chained by destiny. She had built her empire with steel and blood. Yet she could not escape the words written long ago. Luke looked at her, and for the first time, he saw more than the crown. He saw the pain of a life driven by duty and a hope she could not admit aloud. She needed him not only as a husband, but as the key to a future she could not win alone. Luke turned away and walked among the scrolls. His hands touched the rough paper and the stone carvings. He thought of the years he had spent fighting her armies. He thought of the lives lost and the hatred that had burned in his chest. And yet here stood the woman who had caused it all, showing him her most guarded secret. It was not power she sought from him. It was survival, the survival of her people and his. He asked her why she had chosen to tell him now. She said because the time for war was running out. Enemies within her own court were moving against her. Some nobles wanted the fighting to continue because they gained power and wealth from it. If she did not bind the West and East soon, she would lose everything. Her eyes met his, and in them he saw not fear but resolve. She was ready to fight alone if he refused. But she had chosen to trust him with her truth. Silence filled the chamber. Luke felt the weight of two worlds pressing on his shoulders. He could walk away and let the war burn until no one was left to rule, or he could step toward her and carry the burden with her. His pride still fought against the thought, but his heart began to understand. Destiny had not brought him here by chance. It had brought him here to choose. And this choice was greater than any battle he had ever fought. As he left the chamber, he did not give his answer. But his eyes no longer burned with only anger. They carried a question that had no easy reply. The queen watched him go, her face calm, yet her hands clenched at her side. She knew the path was opening. She knew that soon he would decide not with his sword, but with his soul. Days passed after Luke learned of the prophecy. The queen gave him no more words, only silence and waiting. But one evening she called him again. This time she did not ask him to stand in her hall. She asked him to ride with her beyond the walls of the capital. He agreed, though he did not know why. They rode into the night until the city lights faded, and the dark fields stretched before them. At a lonely tower she stopped and told him the truth. She could not marry him unless he proved his loyalty. Her enemies were many, not only beyond the borders but inside her own court. She had learned of a plan to strike against her throne. She needed him to go where her guards could not. She needed him to walk into the shadows of betrayal and return with proof. Luke listened and did not speak for a while. Then he nodded. He understood that this was not just a task, it was a test. Claire was sent with him. She had always been his friend, since childhood, and he trusted her more than most. She had worked as a scout and spy and knew how to move unseen. Together they left under the cover of darkness. The path was long through forests and broken villages scarred by years of war. Along the way, Claire asked him if he had begun to believe the queen's words. He did not answer clearly, but she saw in his eyes that something had changed. They reached the borderlands, where danger waited at every turn. The conspirators hid there in an old fortress, where stone walls had crumbled but shadows still ruled. Luke and Claire crept inside and listened. They heard men speak of taking the queen's crown and selling peace for gold. They spoke of betrayal and murder. The words were poison, yet they were proof of what the queen had said. Luke felt anger rise within him. These were not men of honor, but thieves who fed on war. When they were discovered, the night turned to fire. Swords clashed and arrows flew. Luke fought with the strength that had made his name feared. Claire struck with speed and silence. Together they cut through the dark until the last of the traitors lay silent on the floor. But not all were slain. Some escaped into the woods. Luke chose not to chase them. He had what he needed. He had proof that the queen was surrounded by vipers. He and Claire returned to the capital, bruised and tired, but alive. He walked into the palace carrying scrolls taken from the fortress. In front of the court, he placed them before the queen. Her eyes read the lines and her face did not move, but her hand clenched tight. She looked at him, and in that look there was more than command. There was trust. For the first time, she saw him not as a rival, but as a shield. Whispers filled the hall. Some nobles bowed their heads while others turned pale. They knew their plot had been broken. Luke stood tall, though his body ached. He had done more than bring back proof. He had chosen a side. The queen rose from her throne and spoke to the court. She said that peace would not be broken by traitors, and that the warrior from the west had stood beside her when others had fallen. Her words struck like thunder, and none dared to rise against her. When the court was dismissed, Luke remained. The queen stepped closer, and for a moment the hall was empty, but for them. She told him he had passed the test. He had walked through fire and returned not only as a warrior, but as a man she could trust. Luke did not speak much. He only said that he had done what was right, but in his heart he felt something stir. It was not only duty that bound him to her now. It was something deeper that he could not yet name. The day of decision came with the sound of bells across the city. The people filled the streets, and the nobles crowded the halls. Banners of red and gold hung from the towers, and the air was alive with the hope of peace. Queen Alara stood in her throne room, dressed not in armor, but in robes lined with silver and white. Her crown gleamed under the light, and her face was calm, though her eyes searched for one man. Luke Mercer entered the hall with steady steps. His armor was polished, though still marked by battles. He looked not like a prisoner of war, but like a man who had walked through storms and returned with his head unbowed. The court fell silent as he came before the queen. She asked him once more if he would give his answer. The hall seemed to hold its breath. Luke spoke slowly. He said he had fought many wars and carried the weight of loss in his heart. He said he had sworn to protect his people, and would never kneel to any crown. Yet he had seen her truth and her burden. He had walked into the shadows and found loyalty within her. He said he would not marry her for power or for fear. He would marry her for peace and for the hope that their hands together could stop the endless blood. His voice was clear and strong, and it carried through the hall like the sound of a drum. A hush spread, and then a cheer rose among the people. The queen stepped forward and took his hand. For a moment, they looked at each other not as rivals, but as partners. Her voice was soft but steady as she said before all who watched that this union would bind the East and West. No longer enemies, no longer divided. From that day forward, they would stand as one. The wedding was held in the grand hall that very day. Candles lit the walls and music filled the air. Soldiers and farmers, nobles and merchants all stood together to see the vow. Claire watched with tears in her eyes, knowing that her friend had chosen a path greater than war. The queen spoke her vow, and Luke answered with his own. When their hands were bound and their voices joined, the bells rang again louder than ever before. Outside the palace, the people cheered. They shouted not for conquest, but for peace. Children waved ribbons and old men wept at the sight. For the first time in years, the sound of joy was louder than the sound of war. The streets glowed with torches and songs filled the night sky. East and West had become one in that moment, and the world itself seemed to sigh with relief. When the halls were empty and the night grew quiet, Luke and Alara stood together on the balcony. The city stretched before them, lit with fires of celebration. She asked him if he feared what lay ahead. He said he did not fear as long as they stood together. She smiled not as a queen, but as a woman who had found a partner at last. In that quiet moment, they understood that their union was not the end of struggle, but the beginning of a new path. The prophecy had spoken of ruin or peace. Now it rested in their hands to prove it true. But for that night, they let themselves believe in hope. The warrior from the West and the queen of the East had chosen to stand as one, and the world would remember their choice for centuries to come.